All right, and so you see what I have for you today for perhaps the first time ever, images not from politics or culture or technology, well, kind of technology, but from science, and we'll get there. But I wanted to do a year in review lecture, and of course there's some big developments in science this year, and so we'll get there. But they're nice images, aren't they? Those are from the new James Webb Space telescope looking at nebulas, and then an image of the breakthrough in fusion technology as well. But before we get to the sublime, we got to cover the mundane and absurd politics. And so the very first thing I want to emphasize in looking back on 2022 is something that we talked a lot about in 2022. So it's kind of the most immediate thing on my mind, and that is the election. And as I say, a red wave that turned into a purple still tide. You can see this in terms of historical precedent. This is a different way of thinking about data we've talked about before, which is if you look at presidents who had similarly low approval ratings and how many seats in Congress they lost, right? 30, 60 seats. And I really think that that is, given the fundamentals, what we should have expected for Biden and the Democrats. And instead, they lost less than 10. Something unusual happened in national politics in 2022. I think the big headline is what should have been a wipeout year for the Democrats turned into a very minor fender bender. Similarly, in the Senate, as I've said to you before, this is the first year since 1934 that the sitting president's party has gained a seat. A Democratic sitting president has gained a seat in a midterm election. So that's quite an accomplishment. The Republicans also did well in this election. Another way to think about this is, now we've got all the data, that if this had been a national election, the election for the House, that is, the Republicans would have won the popular vote. First time that that would have happened in quite a while. And they would have won the White House, and that reflects things that happened in Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, even Arizona, New Mexico. Some of these swing states went Republican in terms of their overall congressional vote. But it was, so much of it was concentrated in places where they had already done very well that it didn't really translate into a big landslide victory in Congress. And at the same time, the Democrats have a lot to be happy about, including state politics. We're now, again, got to go back to 1934 to look at a incumbent president whose party won as opposed to losing governorships. And as a result, now the majority of Americans are living in states governed by Democrats. And so those are the results. That's the kind of top line issue. And now we need to think about explaining what happened. And some of this will be familiar review, but some of this, I think, may be a little bit new, a little bit different from what we've talked about in the past. And so I think that the first and perhaps the most important explanation for these surprising results is that Donald Trump is losing his capacity, if he ever had it, to translate his really unprecedented control over attention in the news cycle into electoral success, right? And so in a sense, the luster is off Trump. It seems increasingly likely that the other shoe will drop legally for him. He's been accused of an awful lot, but not yet prosecuted, other than the Trump business practices with tax evasion in New York, where there have now been 17 felony convictions, although it has minor or no real consequences for Trump and his company, except for the reputational consequences. It means that perhaps some banks, some insurers, some consumers won't want to deal with a company that has been convicted of tax felony. But the Congressional Special Committee has made for criminal recommendations to the Department of Justice. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about the effect that not just those recommendations, but the hearings have had on public opinion. And I think now that the report has concluded, the hearings are done, one of the things that we might notice is that these were actually very effective. And we have the polling data to demonstrate the fact that voters changed their minds in ways that affected the outcome of the election based on what the January 6th Congressional Committee revealed and the way in which they revealed it. They're made for TV production values, the graphic demonstration of the nature of the threat and the violence, the use of Republican officials from within Trump's own administration to portray what was going on in the White House in the aftermath of the election. So that's one aspect of the trouble that is bedeviling Trump, and that perhaps translated into a less successful election cycle than most people predicted. In addition, obviously, the Justice Department now has a special counsel who is investigating Donald Trump. And it looks like under 3 or perhaps even 4 different kinds of criminal liability for his effort to overturn the election result, for the January 6th invasion and whether or not he incited it, for the retention of classified documents after he was president in Mar-a-Lago in an unsecured way, and his obstruction of the effort to get the return of those documents. And then whether or not there's a post-election fundraising investigation is a little hard to ascertain, but that's apparently there've been some subpoenas on that as well. He's also being investigated in Georgia, and his businesses are being investigated. So this may be perhaps the final year in which Donald Trump is a dominant figure in American politics, going all the way back to 2015, 2016. We've had a long period. Will 2022 be the sunset year for Donald Trump? And I don't know the answer to that question. He's been resilient, but it certainly doesn't look like he's figured out how to navigate the current situation in a way that works to his advantage. This is seen if we compare the polling of Trump versus DeSantis, the 2 apparent frontrunners for the Republican nomination in 2024. And the polls have begun to tilt in DeSantis's advantage as early as July and August. But in the aftermath of the midterm wipeout of the Republican Party, the polls have moved dominantly in favor of DeSantis, although Trump still gets pretty good polling results. And I do think one of the questions that the Republicans have to be asking themselves, so Trump delivered the presidency in 2016 in what could have been a very good year for the Democrats. And one of the questions is, did he in fact reveal himself to be a uniquely charismatic politician with a genuinely fresh approach, a much more populist approach to politics that revitalized the national electoral chances of the Republican Party? Or did he just get lucky? He won by 40,000 votes in terms of the votes that actually carried him over the finish line in the swing states that resulted in his electoral college victory. And by the way, he lost the popular vote by nearly 7 million. And since then, in 2018, in 2020, and in 2022, the Republicans have not done as well as they would have liked to do, losing successively the House and then the Senate, and then not getting the results they wanted in 2022. And so part of the question here is, does Trump have a Midas touch, or perhaps something more the reverse of that? And the Republicans are beginning to recognize that it was luck, not skill, that produced the results in 2016. Um, and the evidence here, there were a large number of Trump-backed Republicans on the ballot. The vast majority of the Republican Party either said that the election was stolen, or that there was some evidence of impropriety or fraud, or that they had no opinion on those issues. Fewer than 10% of Republican candidates in 2022 said that the results of the 2020 election were correct, and they paid a price for this, right? A 7% gap almost in competitive districts between Republicans closely associated with Trump that drove the electorate in the direction of the Democrats, and Republicans that distanced themselves from Trump, who did very well. Nationally, that gap was about 5%. And what I think is worth noticing, and we're just getting some polling data that seems to demonstrate this, is that the January 6th Congressional Investigative Committee seems to have moved opinion in important places, right? And so starting with the swing states, in 4 out of the 5 swing states, if you compare Republicans who didn't split their tickets with Republicans who did, and ask them how important was January 6th as an issue, you can see for the Republicans who split their tickets, voted in some cases for Republicans, but in other cases for Democrats, the January 6th issue was a more significant issue. Sometimes as much as 50% more of them said it was an important issue. And again, of these ticket splitters, they're concerned about the Republican Party having extremist views, spreading misinformation and conspiracy theory, supporting Trump after he lost the election, encouraging the attack on January 6th, promoting anti-democratic views, and suggesting the use of force. And so when we go back for a second and see that 70% of Republican voters suspect election fraud, so presumably that 70% is more or less happy with the fact that they've got candidates all over the country. Most voters have a choice to vote for at least one election denier, but 30% is actually a big number. And if that 30% is not just indifferent, but in fact concerned about this trend, then the cost of nominating MAGA Republicans in 2022 may have actually been very high. A little bit more evidence on this when we look at in what ways did the hearings from the Congressional Special Investigative Committee affect you. The increased awareness and concern for democracy, large percentage, right? 60%. 50% increased awareness and concern about January 6th itself, right? And there, the graphicness of the video footage, I think, really laid bare the nature of the violence and the threat, and how close, in fact, it came to perhaps embroiling members of Congress or even the vice president. And then 45% say it affected their voting in the general election, a third their primary voting decisions as well. And of that 45%, right, who say it affected their vote in the general election, fully a third, or almost a third, I'm sorry, 2/3 say it was very important in the way they voted, right? And so again, I want to suggest this may be an extremely important factor in Republican leadership. Maybe Republican rank and file are awakening to the fact that Trump helps them and hurts them, and that the way in which he hurts them may outweigh the way in which he helps them. A second factor in 2022, both in the general election results, especially at the national level, but I want to say just an independent, important aspect of our society is, of course, that Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision that created the right to abortion, was overturned by the new ultra conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court. And as a result of that, the number of women who have access to abortion, whether it's legal until the age of viability or legal in the first 20 to 24 weeks, has diminished substantially. The number of women living in states where abortion is banned has gone from 0% to nearly 25%. And I know I've shared this cartoon with you before. It's funny and not funny. Which amendment protects us from the Supreme Court, says one woman to another. And of course, the answer is no amendments, but perhaps elections, right? And so one big question, I think, coming out of 2022 is, how important was abortion and in what way did it matter? We know that for many Americans, abortion was the most important issue in this election. It was overall the second most important issue behind inflation. And I want to suggest that for the people for whom it's the most important issue, it probably matters in a different way than inflation matters. One way to express this is if you think back to the civil rights movement and you think back to the fact that there were people willing to engage in civil disobedience, willing to go to jail, willing to go on freedom rides and to risk mob violence, having their buses set on fire, willing to engage in voter registration drives in Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and to risk threat to life and limb as a result, children willing to go on marches and in the process to face down police water cannons or dogs being sicked on them. And then ask yourself, right? Would people be willing to put themselves at risk like that for inflation? And I think that the answer is clearly no, right? We may care about it. It may impact us substantially, but it's different than a fundamental threat to your civil rights, to a change in the way in which the Constitution is interpreted that threatens your ability to be an equal citizen. We know 1 in 4 American women have abortions, that women have built their lives around access to abortions, that when women are denied access to abortions, their lives and prospects suffer. Their education is interrupted, their careers are interrupted. They are sometimes forced into marriages or relationships with men they would prefer not to be with men whom they may think are abusive or inadequate as fathers, that they are forced to do things that they consider to be damaging to their current or their future children. The majority of women who get abortions already have children. The majority of women who get abortions have children in the future. They don't think that they are ready, or even more importantly, able to responsibly have children at the moment they get abortions. And now our society is saying that option may no longer be available to you. This feels like an assault on their civil rights, and this may therefore be motivating them. You can see it in the voter registration data, right? And these are states where women registered more in 2022 than they did in 2020. And you can see that's the vast majority of states, and it's much higher for women than it is for men. There are in fact some states where men registered less, very few states where women registered less. We see it in the swing in the polls. We see it in the degree to which Democrats care about abortion. We see it in their motivation to participate, to vote. And so the election then raises a number of questions. If part of the explanation is that Trump is now more of a drag than a boost to the Republicans, another big part of the explanation is abortion. Is this an instance of democratic learning, where I should really put democratic small d, not the party, but our public as a whole, our citizens as a whole? And so I think one way to think about Donald Trump, right, is that for decades, many voters felt that neither party had nominated someone who really expressed their sense of anger, their grievances, their sense that the political system was non-responsive to their urgent social needs as they had become more precarious, as they began to feel more marginal in American politics. And Trump seemed to give vent to some of that discontent, anger, resentment. And so some voters went with Trump. But 6 years on, they have a better understanding of who Donald Trump is. They have a better understanding that protest politics may give vent to those frustrations, but doesn't actually do much to help people, may in fact make things worse, and may in fact actually threaten democratic institutions that, though we are in certain respects disgusted with, not willing yet to completely give up on. And so I don't know the answer to that question, but 2022 seems to raise that question. Is the American electorate starting to behave differently? Are we perhaps less polarized and calcified than we were in the last 20 years? The fact that you have Republicans who split their tickets, who said, I'll vote for Brian Kemp for governor because he seems to be doing a pretty good job, but I'm not going to vote for Herschel Walker. He doesn't have any qualifications. He's got a ton of scandals following him, and he seems to lie a lot, right? And by the way, he's closely associated with Donald Trump, who I'm no longer that impressed with. And so in the past, I don't think there would have been as much ticket splitting, as much independence. People simply feared the other side too much to do anything to assist it, and held their nose and voted for whoever their party nominated. Are we perhaps breaking a little bit out of that calcified form of political action? Is Trump finally beginning to fade? He's down. Is he out? We don't know. He's proven himself to be quite resilient. But having said that, I'm not seeing anything fresh. I'm not seeing anything that doesn't look incredibly stale, which was innovative and important in 2016. But in 2022 and 2024, other Republicans who have less baggage, less legal liability, are adopting aspects of Trump's successful message and perhaps out trumping Trump in certain respects. So I'm not sure that he will be resilient beyond 2022. So 2022 may be, in retrospect, the sunset year for Donald Trump. If so, will 2022 mark a new direction or the beginning of a new direction for the Republican Party? And this would be to double down on the idea of democratic learning, that what happened in the electorate in 2022 is not just that a large enough share of Republicans turned against Trump to make him a liability for their party, to outweigh the fact that he clearly mobilizes a certain core constituency. Will it actually discredit not only him, but his brand of politics? Have people awoken to the idea that an ethno-racial, authoritarian kind of populism may feel like a good way to express certain fears and perhaps translate anxiety into anger, but it doesn't actually lead anywhere? I'm not saying it will, but I'm saying I think that there's at least some possible signs that this will extend beyond Trump. How much and what way will abortion and constitutional politics matter for the future of American electoral politics? Is 2022 just the immediate reaction to Dobbs and to the assault on abortion rights that the Supreme Court has brought about? And once we've given vent to our anger about that, will we then move on? Or will this be something akin to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, what scholars often refer to as the long civil rights movement, tracing it all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century? Will we see a reawakening of the constitutional track in American politics that, in retrospect, we'll say that probably started in 2022? And then, of course, we do have presidential elections in less than 2 years now. And who will lead the parties? Will Joe Biden determine that he wants to be the president who overcomes ageism, the discrimination against octogenarians, and shows that he can be capable not only in his late 70s, but also into his mid 80s in office? Or will he make way for someone else? Will anyone else challenge him? If Donald Trump is fading, does that just mean DeSantis is rising? Or is there perhaps a Nikki Haley or a Liz Cheney in the wings who might take the Republican Party in a somewhat different direction? All right, so one more big thing from 2022 in terms of politics. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that in terms of legislative success, Joe Biden may have had the most productive 2 years of any president since LBJ. And I want to be careful because he does not have a kind of signature social policy accomplishment in the same way that George W. Bush had No Child Left Behind or Barack Obama had the Affordable Care Act. But when you string together the large COVID relief bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, and the CHIPS bill, this is a consequential presidency in 2 years with the most slender congressional majority possible, a tied Senate, a tiny little minority in the House of Representatives, and it's making a difference on the most consequential issue facing the world today, climate change. And you can see the data here. We have been slowly but surely bringing our level of carbon emissions down. To be clear, where we really need to be is at 0 by 2030. And clearly we are still not there. We're still going to emit in 2030 and 2035 around 3 billion metric tons of carbon per year. That's 3 billion too much, but it's a lot better than 5 billion or 6 billion, right? And that's the course we were on before the Paris Accords, before the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I think another thing we're going to point to in doing the history of 2022 is that this was the first year the United States passed meaningful climate change legislation. All right, so third issue, what's happening in the economy? And in particular, I think 2022 will be the year in which we reckoned with the fact that inflation was not transitory and a self-curing disease, but in fact, an increasingly structural problem and one that needed to be controlled. But I guess I want to raise the question, and this is more speculative. Will we ultimately conclude that 2022 was also a year in which fundamental structural changes, deep changes to the global economy began to manifest? And this is the thesis, among others, of Mohamed El-Erian, very well respected economist, currently the head of Queen's College Cambridge, formerly the CEO of PIMCO, which is one of the largest bond traders in the world, and on President Obama's Global Economic Advisors team. And he has a book, The Only Game in Town, about central banks and the outsized role they've been playing in the economy for the last 15-ish years, and also an article in Foreign Affairs, which if you want a quick overview of his thinking, I recommend that piece to you. It's short and reasonably approachable. And what Elarian suggests, and it's not just him, other people are noticing this too, that there are some really profound changes occurring in our economy. And one of those, I think the place to start is that we're moving out of an economy in which insufficient demand, right? Not enough people buying what the economy is producing is the primary problem. And I think for much of the last 20, 30 years, this has been the dominant diagnosis, that as we become more unequal, as the bottom 50% has less disposable income with which to purchase the stuff that drives the economy, the lagging in demand has put a drag on the economy as a whole. And if you know your basics of neoclassical macroeconomics, the two big factors that determine how an economy does, where it equilibrates, are supply and demand. And so the policies of the last 30 years have been designed to bolster demand, especially by making credit and money easier to get access to for those who are no longer in possession of sufficient disposable income. And if instead we're shifting to an economy in which there's insufficient supply, a shortage of goods available at the time that people want to purchase them, of the kind that people want to purchase, then are we entering a different economic era? And the underlying change driving the analysis that suggests that it might be a supply side as opposed to a demand side problem in the economy right now are changes in the nature of globalization. And for much of the last 30 years, during the period of globalization, the emphasis in the production of goods has been on efficiency. And what that really means is bringing costs down. And the way to do that is to always find the least expensive supplier of the component of the thing that you're making. If you're making a car, you get your rubber from Malaysia and your glass from Indonesia, your chips from South Korea, etc. Right? And then you get them all shipped to Japan or Germany or Detroit at exactly the right moment to assemble everything. And what's happened in the last couple years is that model has been exposed as having real weaknesses. And the term resiliency captures those weaknesses. We have not been able to get the supplies to the place in which the good is being assembled in time for it to actually make it to the marketplace to meet the demand for it. Right. And so it's one thing to say, I'll buy the cheapest computer if I can walk down to Best Buy and get it tomorrow. But if I got to wait 6 months, I might buy a somewhat more expensive computer to be able to get it when I want it or need it. And this then is the idea of resiliency, that what we need, or what corporate decision makers are saying they need, is a supply chain that is resilient, that they're always going to be able to get what they need it when they need it, and they'll pay more for it. And this means that there's been a transition from offshoring, go wherever the cheapest price is, to what is being called friend or near shoring, go to the places that are closer, that are more reliable, that are more stable, that have COVID better under control, even if it's more expensive. So that's one aspect of the sense that perhaps the global economy is not going to supply things at quite the volume that it has up until now. A second aspect has to do with a widespread labor shortage, especially in the developing world. You are probably seeing this, that the great resignation, it's sometimes being called, right? The idea that a whole bunch of people quit their jobs and many people are reluctant to come back. Our economy is creating more jobs than we have people to fill. And sometimes this is called a job skills mismatch, right? It's just that the people don't have the skills that the employers want. That isn't what seems to be happening in the economy right now. As opposed to that, it seems like overall labor participation is going down. This is especially true for people over 50 who in recent years were typically working into their 60s and 70s, but appear to be retiring earlier and unwilling to re-enter the labor force later in life. And there are multiple explanations for this, among them obviously COVID. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but one of, I think, the really persuasive analyses around COVID right now is that we have kind of a bifurcated or two different experiences of the pandemic. On the one hand, we have people who are relatively young, 50 and younger, to take an arbitrary number, maybe 60 and younger, who feel healthy, who maybe have got the disease and gotten through it and turned out to be okay, who are taking greater risks, who are returning in many respects to the pre-pandemic lifestyles. But as a result, people who are somewhat older, who have comorbidities, are feeling increasingly at risk. They can't go in those places where the younger, more risk tolerant people are going because they are unwilling to tolerate that risk because they perceive themselves often accurately as more vulnerable, and therefore they can't go to work in a workplace where there are young people who are going to expose them. um, I think that's one explanation. I think another explanation, and we need more information. We need more interviews, more data, more ethnographic information. But I'm inclined to believe that a second explanation is that our jobs are, in many sectors of the economy, just not great jobs anymore. They're not that well paid. They don't treat people that well or with dignity. They're not very interesting. They don't demand a lot of intelligence or creativity, and therefore they don't engage the worker. And it's one thing to do that when you're in your 20s and your 30s and you haven't been doing it for decades, when you need the money to start a family and start a life. But if you've been doing that for 30 or 40 years already, and you find yourself no longer so much in need, maybe you begin to think of yourself not as a worker, but as retired, right? And so one of the things we see is if you think of yourself as unemployed, that's a low status position to be in. It feels anxious, it feels insecure. People want to get out of it and get back to work. But if you think of yourself as retired, I don't need to tell you guys this, you end up thinking of yourself in a different status position and no longer in need of finding work to be able to secure your social position or standing in society. And so if the choice is, well, I can go back to a crappy job in order to be employed, or I can call myself retired at an earlier age than I planned to, a lot of people seem to be taking the second choice. And that may not be only about self-protection from COVID, but also in a sense about the so-called utility function, the increased income from work is not worth all the degradation, humiliation, boredom that comes with so many jobs that have been transformed by technology, that are less well compensated, that are less well respected in the 21st century economy. Another aspect contributing to an insufficient supply of goods is the decrease in migration that is very much caused by COVID and by countries tightening their borders and by people changing their calculus about whether it makes sense to move at this particular moment. And then finally, something I'll talk with you more about in coming weeks, the lifespan revolution. People are living longer, and many people are not willing to work into their 70s, 80s, 90s, as many people are now living. And so that changes the ratio of people consuming goods to the number of people producing goods. And all of this then suggests that perhaps inflation is not just being caused by short-term transient problems, bottlenecks in supply chain in the post-COVID world, but in fact by more stable, long-term structural changes. And a final factor that seems potentially to be crimping the supply of goods, and that may in fact do more of that in the future, is that economic fundamentals are beginning to be altered to take into account climate change. This is especially true in Europe, where they are working hard to decarbonize their economy, and where that may affect, in fact, is beginning to affect, for instance, the ability of Tesla to produce their vehicles where they want to, at the rate that they want to. And so this is a third source of potential loss of supply in the modern global economy. So second big factor that people like Mohamed El-Erian, but many other people are noticing, is the end of the era of easy money or liquidity. And so this is where El-Erian really focuses in his book. And his suggestion is that from 2007, 2008, we've been in an era of central banks being the major economic actor, right? The Congress and other legislatures have been too paralyzed. Oh, give me 1 second. I hope you're hearing me okay. I just got that notification that my internet is unstable, and I see I'm on the wrong internet. Was I freezing at all? Were you hearing me okay, I hope? Are you hearing me now? How about now? Are you hearing me now? I'm going to wait one more moment. Okay, so I'm seeing people move. Ruth, are you hearing me okay? Oops. One more try. Are you hearing me okay now?
Yeah,
Yes?
now we
Okay.
can.
And I know, oh boy. You still hearing me okay or not? Okay, I
Lost
know
him
this is
completely.
frustrating for you. It's frustrating for me as well. Are you hearing me okay?
Just a moment.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna keep going. It sounds like to mute again, Anne. With apologies, I know this is frustrating. Oh boy, I think I lost it again. Is it working at this point? Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, it keeps coming in and out, and I'm back on the other internet, which is the less good internet, but it appears to be more stable at the moment. So I'm
Can't
gonna keep.
see you.
You can't see me?
It's going in and out.
Yeah, I think it will be better now, but I can't assure you. I'm sorry, it's really not under my control. I think I just got off a plane last night, and it looks like maybe something went amiss with my internet while I was away. I think this will work. Are you hearing me? And I'm
Yes.
seeing you move. That's usually a good sign. So let me try to continue. And please just bear with me if we end up with occasional pauses. My apologies. But so I was trying to make my way through the analysis of Mohamed El-Erian, and the big second factor that he points to as and one way to put this is that this is not just a business cycle that we're going through. We have growth, we have recession, we have growth, we have recession, but the current downturn in our economy is more than a cyclical change within a current form of capitalism. It's an indication that aspects of the structure of capitalism are changing, that we're moving away from unrestrained globalization to partial disintegration of the global economy, that we're moving away from full labor force participation to lesser labor force participation, that we're moving away from a carbonized economy to a less carbonized economy. And so it's not going to work to just treat it like it's a ordinary recession. That we're going to need to reckon with these deeper changes. A second big aspect of this is this end of era of liquidity, where in 2007, 2008, 2009, as the Great Recession gripped the world economy, many governments seemed incapable of acting adequately. And so central banks like the Federal Reserve stepped in, and they transferred the coping with economic crises from fiscal to monetary policy, as opposed to the government changing taxes and spending the way we did with the New Deal, for instance, Keynesianism so-called. Will just rely on the central bank to reduce interest rates, and in particular, quantitative easing, the central bank not just making money cheap, but also actually buying bonds to increase the money supply. That came to be, El-Erian suggests, a crutch that we became addicted to, and that has had all kinds of moral hazards or negative consequences and incentives associated with it. So when we combine this with then the fact that we had another global recession, and it was a recession of just kind of an incredibly steep cliff. Just every economy hit the brakes simultaneously with COVID. And then governments not only relied on central banks, but also did a lot of stimulative spending. We have this huge influx of money into the economy in 2020, in the early 2020s, without recognizing how fragile the economic system has become as a result of 15 years of reliance on unsustainable central bank policy. And the unsustainability of this policy reflects the fact that easy money, on the one hand, encourages financial markets to take risks that really should not be taken. When money is that easy, when you can borrow for next to nothing, financial actors end up using leverage, borrowed money, to search for new speculative asset classes. Cryptocurrency, I think, is a key example here, but hedge funds and other private equity funds that are less regulated became more and more aggressive in finding new startups, new stocks, new investment derivatives and mechanisms. And the result is that there was just a frenzy of speculative investing that now has to be washed out of the overall global economy and financial system, and it's creating deep fragility and liability. And you add to that what this did was not only decouple the financial market from the real economy. All this money is being made in stocks and derivatives and things like cryptocurrency, when in fact the rate of productivity is sluggish, does not justify these high returns, because the easy money means that investors just keep bidding up the value of these asset classes. And you combine that with the fact that what this did, in fact, was increase inequality, generate not sustained and inclusive growth, but sugar high and top biased growth. And the result is that the investor class has gotten rich artificially, while everybody else who might be able to sustain a more robust model of economic growth has been left out. And this means that this model needs to come to an end. But it's really hard to wean ourselves of easy money when the economy and the financial system has been relying on it for over a decade. And so the consequence of this, if this analysis is correct, is that there's tremendous fragility in financial markets. I spoke with you a little bit about the idea that Adam Tooze calls a polycrisis economic scenario, in which multiple crises occur at the same time and overwhelm the capacity of banks and governments to cope with it. And this is going to be particularly difficult while trying to cope with inflation at the same time. So that's a little speculative. What we know for sure is that 2022 seems to provide a lot of evidence that this speculation has some bite, some insight to it. So what we see in 2022 is all these markets that have been growing in a sustained way for a long time came crashing back to earth, right? This is the overall picture. This is crypto, which I hope nobody in this room was in fact invested in crypto. If so, you can kind of smile at this wild roller coaster ride up and then crashing down, losing more than 60% of its value over the course of a single year. By the way, it looks a lot like Tesla stock. The S&P 500 lost almost 20% of its value. Emerging markets were down at one point over 30%, though they came back somewhat at the end of the year. This was a rough year for markets, and the scenario I've just been sketching suggests it's not just because we're in a recessive period in a business cycle, but because in a sense we've come to the end of the model that was sustaining these high market values. And some of these values just needed to be washed out of the markets. It's also a year of high inflation, and you can see, at least in the United States, inflation rose, but then over the last few months, it's begun to come down. We can only hope that that will continue in that direction. Of course, there's no guarantee. Part of the reason it's come down is because there's been this incredibly aggressive and rapid series of interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve, which has pushed up the cost of borrowing money considerably in this country. But here's what I think is particularly illuminating. The diagram on the left of the screen shows that the main source of inflation, the main source, I should say, of problems in manufacturing, but that contributes directly to a shortage of goods, which contributes to inflation, is now an insufficient supply of labor, followed by an insufficient supply of materials. And often that's a result of an insufficient supply of labor and not logistic or transportation constraints, right? And so again, that seems to support the Allarian thesis that this is a problem with the overall nature of a global economy that is partially disintegrating. And as you can see, right, the bottlenecks in the supply chain seem to be opening in 2022. So, fourth big issue for 2022 in review, and I'll try to bring this to a close as quickly as possible, has to do with world politics, not American politics or the economy. And here, the Russian assault on the Ukraine, but also in the post-Cold War global order, I think is the major development. As you can see, battlefield deaths in Europe are now probably higher than at any point since World War II. The only possible competitor would be the Bosnian War when Yugoslavia fell apart in the early 1990s. It's hard to get reliable data, but it certainly does appear that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is in the same league. And then we look at and here this is aid given to the Ukraine, but this helps to, I think, get to the second factor. It's not just that Russia invaded its neighbor and in so doing is trying to destabilize the norms of the post-Cold War political order. It's also that mutual dependence or interdependence, economically speaking, is being weaponized. And so you can think of the Russian effort to use inflation and in particular European reliance on their oil and natural gas exports to keep the European Union countries, the NATO countries, from aggressively supporting the Ukraine. But you can also think of the effort of the West, especially the United States, to essentially exclude Russia from the international financial system, which had been up until this point basically a neutral system, unless you're Iran or North Korea, to keep them from being able to sell their petrochemicals to support their war effort. Again, I think a deep shift in the structure of international relations that is not exhausted by thinking about what's happening in the Ukraine. A third major development, maybe this should really be the biggest development. It's hard to say in 2022 what will be the most important 4 or 10 or 20 years from now. But President Xi of China secured his third term and moved China in a more assertive, aggressive direction internationally. You can see in this diagram, right, earlier speeches, more recent speeches in Communist Party addresses, and the mention of the economy, the mention of reform, ranking very high in the 80s and 90s, but declining in more recent speeches, the mention of security and military going up. And that's a good indication, I think, of the direction China is moving in. And then I think it's worthwhile noting that there were 2 major environmental conferences of the participants organized by the United Nations, one on climate change, one on biodiversity, and they both basically came to the same conclusion, which is that the developed world is primarily responsible for the environmental catastrophes facing the world today, and that it needs to do more to support less developed countries. And we'll have to see if those principled agreements translate into actual binding commitments or not. But that is, I think, another thing that had never happened before, that happened for the first time in 2022. Countries like the United States and the European Union agreeing that they have a responsibility to less well-off countries to assist them. All right, next big idea. Is 2022 the year in which we began to bring the COVID pandemic under control, in which it is increasingly looking like in many places in the world, though certainly not in China, an endemic as opposed to a pandemic, right? So a disease that crops up and does damage, but doesn't spread in an uncontained way across populations that have no effective immune response because the antibodies are widespread enough that most of us have the ability to fight it off. And you can see the data here. And really, although there was a sharp spike in the beginning of 2022, it has come much more under control. And touch wood, so far in the winter of 2022, 2023, we're not seeing anything like we saw in the previous two winters in terms of the spikes. Having said that, I think we need to also recognize, right, this downward trend in vaccinations. And that is a worrisome trend. I do think, in a sense, if we're seeing less spread and less fatalities, that is probably as much to do with so-called herd immunity, right? Immunity acquired by actually coming in contact with people who have the disease than it is by vaccination or by medically induced immunity. And I just want to notice for 1 second, and I think this is quite phenomenal. Not too long ago, I was listening to medical experts interviewed about this, and they were saying, look, we're having between 1,000 and 2,000 deaths a day in the United States. And we should, if we had adequate vaccination, only be having around 300 deaths a day. Now, I always want to be careful in saying only 300 deaths a day. That's still a lot. But when you compare it with 1,000 to 2,000, obviously it's a significant reduction. And now we are actually pretty close to that 300 deaths a day that some immunologists feel effective widespread vaccination would have brought about. Next factor, and now we get to our fun images. There were some big events in science, and I think perhaps the one I would highlight most is fusion, right? And so the first successful fusion experiment, in the sense of an experiment where the amount of energy that went in was less than the amount of energy that came out. There's still a lot of work to be done. I don't know exactly, but from what I understand, maybe a decade or two before this becomes a viable source of electricity. But in particular, since it appears we're almost certainly going to have to do carbon capture, right? Take some of the greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere out of the atmosphere, and that's incredibly difficult and energy intensive to do. If we can develop a source of energy that does not produce greenhouse gases and is highly productive, highly efficient, then we've got a better chance of actually getting the greenhouse situation, the global climate change and heating situation under control. The other big development of the year that I guess I'll emphasize is the James Webb Space Telescope, this incredibly complex operation that started, I think, on Christmas Day of 2021, but took months for it to reach its place in orbit and to unfold and to get its solar panels and satellites all in place, is now producing these images of the universe and helping us to see further and with greater clarity into space than we ever have before. And I suspect that as the years go by, this will allow us to better understand our universe and our infinitesimally small place in it. Final thing I'll emphasize just for a moment is that not only science but technology continue to grow in this incredibly accelerated way, and that there were big breakthroughs in artificial intelligence this year. And so I've got a couple different images that I've shared with you before of galloping and runaway technological change, right? Mickey being ultimately almost drowned by the tools he's bewitched, the angel of history blown out of control by the storm, moving him away from paradise. This was a year in which Elon Musk took over Twitter, appears to be possibly running it into the ground. TikTok took over social media. Google, for the first time, saw, I think, a real, genuine threat to its core business model, the data search model on the internet. And that's because this is the year in which we had big breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. Very quickly, I imagine you're hearing about this in terms of chatbots, but the underlying technology is the GPT-3 language model, which powers a text bot that basically listens to you and produces something in response to your comment or question that seems an awful lot like it could be produced by another human being. And it's not like Alexa, programmed to answer your questions in very precise ways. It's doing something akin to thinking, searching everything out there on the web and putting it together in a what appears to be creative way. And so AI is beginning to show some signs that it can do something like think. I don't want to say it's sentient yet, and I want to go into greater depth with you on these topics in future lectures. But I want to emphasize how this is working, right? And that there are these new computer programming techniques, been around for around a decade, but really bearing fruit this year, that are called massive neural networks. And the idea here is not to try to write a program, but to try to in a sense, reproduce the structure of the neurons of the human brain, create a whole bunch of little programs that generate little outputs and connect them to each other and see if they can learn. And when we refer to machine learning, usually that's what we're referring to. And so as opposed to programming these massive neural networks to do things, we are letting them learn for themselves how to do things. And they seem to be getting more and more capable. And so this leads me to three concluding questions on this topic. What will this technology do to human nature, right? And so I've argued with you before that digital technology, especially its social media employment, is changing our attention span, our emotions or affect, our communication, our intellects. And I think this new technology is a comparable revolutionary technology. It's not ubiquitous. It's not commercially employed at scale yet, but we should anticipate that it will change us. It's not just going to be a neutral tool. One of the ways in which it's going to change us is it's going to change our economy. And in particular, it seems like it's going to get better and better at doing the things that we do. And as it replaces drivers and seamstresses and people who do all kinds of work, how are we going to react? And please note that this stuff is owned by mega wealthy corporations, and there's no requirement that they share its benefits with us. And then one final question, which I think is kind of the flip side of this. Not saying that this technology is sentient yet, but it seems that going forward, it's going to have more and more of the attributes of sentience, right? These are thinking machines, and machines that are engineered to be curious, to have reward circuitry that's a lot like our experience of gratification and pain. And if we engineer technology to do this, are we simply going to be able to treat it as if it's a passive piece of machinery, or are we going to have to develop an ethics, not only for what it does to us and how we handle its economic consequences, but also for what we do to it? So that's a little food for thought in terms of what's been going on in 2022. Let me stop there and open it up for questions. What do you think? I know I went on for a while. Sorry for the technical glitch there. I hope it's been good going forward from that. Who wants to start us off? Yes, go ahead, Renee. You're going to have to unmute yourself, though. There you go.
Yes, I'm very concerned about the ethics of the AI in what algorithms are put into it. You know, there are people who feed it information, and whether one race is better than another, or one the ethics is very difficult. It's like the train problem in philosophy. You know, how do you? It has to open up worms. It's just terrible ethical problems. And the other one, I guess, is that it's not just that it's going to be replacing the seamstresses and the drivers. It's replacing the doctors and the lawyers and so it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of jobs survive.
Yeah, and let me comment on the first half of what you said. And one of the things about machine learning, and there's a book on this called The Alignment Problem, which is you can create a thinking, learning machine. How well can you get it to align with what you want it to do, right? And so we want it to help us solve problems. So, one of the things that they're trying to get machine learning to do is use images from phones to diagnose skin cancer, so that people who can't get access to the right medical care because they're in a poor country can nevertheless get the right diagnosis, and then that may help them to get the right treatment. It turns out that the machine learns funny things, right? So all of the images in medical textbooks of people who have skin cancer have rulers next to them, so you can measure the size of the growth of the mole or the lesion. And so the machine comes to conclude that if it's skin cancer, it must have a ruler next to it, right? And so that's kind of a funny but interesting example, right? And that speaks to the fact that the machine is really learning. It's not just doing what we tell it to do, it's trying to figure out for itself how to do it. But having said that, right, if we are racist, if we are sexist, if that is guiding what it is we do, if we're discriminatory in subtle and implicit ways that the machine perhaps picks up on better than we do, and we are asking it to help us make decisions in the way in which we make decisions, we see it a lot, right? That job screening technology turns out to be more sexist and more racist than we are. That the technology that's supposed to assist judges in being unbiased in sentencing ends up being more biased in sentencing than we are, because it's amplifying our biases, our prejudices. So yes, I do think that's a deep concern. And it does speak to the way in which, in a sense, we're learning about ourselves through this technology in all kinds of ways. And we do have to be careful. One way this is expressed by one of the people who I think is very interesting on this is that there's no such thing as a perfect model, right? And that's I guess a saying that statisticians use, but that the problem with machine learning is that it can increasingly make the model be reality, right? That it can enforce the model on the world. And then if the model isn't perfect, but in fact is racist, is sexist, is classist, and it is put in charge of decision making, we end up in a world that starts looking more like the machine learning wants it to look, or thinks we want it to look. Yeah, thank you, Renee. I think that's a really good comment. And I will be returning to these issues in the future. I want to try to myself learn more about them and then share what I learned with you. Flossie, go ahead. You got to unmute, Flossie. I think you did it. Nope. Where'd you go? Did we lose Flossie? I don't see her anymore. No, you're there. Flossie, you turned your camera off, but you have to unmute. Okay, your camera's back. You're still muted. Hold the space bar down or push that little microphone icon.
I'm holding the space bar.
Done, good.
Okay, can I talk now?
Yes, please.
I'm thinking of public education. What happens to that machine can get into a little space machine, have that apparatus with you, and teach yourself and go spinning off into outer space. There's no more public school. There's no more. What becomes? Who needs a teacher then? You have a machine. You live with the machine. The machine becomes your companion. It supplies your food. You don't need clothes. You live in a capsule. I'm not making this up. E.M. Forster made it up in one of his great stories, where people live in private capsules.
Yeah, and so I have to say, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking maybe I need to teach a course on, and then I was thinking, how do I combine science fiction and political science, right? Political science fiction, something like that, right? But the idea that in a sense, the world we're entering is a world that in certain respects is a world that has only been imagined as a fictional world. And please note, I mean, I think back to those images that the Webb telescope is generating for us, and the new VR goggles, which I've only used once to see what it would be like to be in a beach in Jamaica, but you could equally use them to see what it'd be like to be in a space capsule exploring one of those fabulous nebula, right? And so I think on the one hand, yes, it distantiates us from the world we're in, and that's a problem. Right. On the other hand, it may open up new worlds of learning. That might be interesting. You started out by asking how we educate the machine. And I have to admit, I lost you for a second, Flossie, but it had me thinking, that was because of my internet connection, not because of what you said. It had me thinking about one of the metaphors that Brian Christian, who writes about this, uses to talk about this new chat box technology. And he says it's like the machine has been in a windowless room for its whole life with nothing but an internet connection, right? So one of the examples of a question you can ask this chat box is, how much ground linoleum should I put in my cereal? And it will give you an answer. 1 to 2 teaspoons is what most people prefer, because it doesn't know that people don't put ground linoleum into their cereal, right? It knows that ground linoleum is a thing and cereal is the thing, and most people who put ground something into their cereal put 1 or 2 teaspoons. And so, yes, it needs some education too. John, go ahead.
Well, I've heard it observed that the real use of virtual reality is about 5 years away, always has been and always will be.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the parallel to this is what's the real use of artificial intelligence or machine learning, right? And so far it's being used to drive algorithms that are being used to capture our attention. And that's proved fairly lucrative. But on the other hand, you don't need what's sometimes called generalized super intelligence, right? The ability to think about everything in a very fast and comprehensive way with a ton of information. You just need a very narrow ability to notice what people are spending time on and to detect the patterns for it. And Google with its DeepMind, or I guess I have to call it Alphabet now, right? That the parent company of Google has this branch DeepMind that is spending, I guess it's approaching billions of dollars on this. And apparently what they tell their shareholders is, well, we don't know exactly what we're going to do with this until we develop it, right? And so that's a kind of parallel, right? Just to say, there's all this money being spent chasing this technology without quite knowing why it's going to be valuable. And I hate to say it, but this is one of the things we should be concerned about is once they come up with it, they're going to have a real need to commercialize it very quickly. Go ahead, John.
I just wanted to report that I put the question of how much ground linoleum should I put in my breakfast cereal into AI chat box. And it said, I'm sorry, but it is not safe or appropriate to consume ground linoleum or any other type of flooring material made from this and that and the other thing. It's not intended for consumption and it can be harmful. Only consume food items that are safe and suitable for human consumption. That sounds like good advice to me.
So you really do have a chat bot? That's not Google?
No, it's the AI chatbot. It's the one that's had all. I just
Cereal.
to Google and it came up AI chat box and I signed into it and I asked that question.
Good.
Alexa,
Well, I
Siri.
think this example probably got enough attention that it figured out that it wasn't giving us the right answer. Have you been playing around with it, John?
No, this is the first time I used it.
Okay. Okay.
So far, it's doing great.
Okay. Well, 1 for 1 is pretty good. All right, everybody. Anybody else with a question or a comment for today? I have one more thing to say to you, which is Happy New Year. I hope you will be safe. I hope you will be well. I hope it will be a good year in 2023 for all of us. Wonderful as always being with you. Take care.
Happy New Year.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Be well. Bye-bye. Be well.